Welcome to another episode of the Chris Rodmack Show, where every week we discuss trends in AI, the latest developments, and what this means for the enterprise and society as a whole. And as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Chris. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
And Max.
Hello.
So this week we have many developments, both in the regulatory space as well as in the funding and development of new models. Just for example, yesterday, Meta announced a new model, Solana 3.1, so where we're seeing how fast everything is just happening, where pretty much every week there's a new model that's been announced, but also many other changes that is happening across industries. And that's why we have a set of developments that we have selected to discuss today. We're discussing on two new large funding rounds. We're discussing on regulatory developments both in Europe as well as overseas in Japan. And then we're discussing on the development that's happening in China on having models that have to comply to certain type of restrictions and limits that are imposed by the government there in China. So let's get started. So with our first development of the week, which is that Fei-Fei Lin, who very well-known professor from Stanford, really one of the best-known figures in this space, she announced that she launched $1 billion startup called World Labs. And not only that, but also that this is $1 billion round. This is remarkable, even by AI measurements. And maybe Max can tell us why this is so important.
First of all, thank you so much. It's good to be back. In terms of what I think about Fei-Fei Li's startup, first thing that came to mind when she's building a startup around spatial intelligence was basically Arnold Schwarzenegger coming out and say "Hasta la vista, baby." That's the first thing that came to mind. I think developing a lot of models in more like language space and more knowledge space, I think getting into the spatial space is interesting to me because it starts to touch the real world. When I say the real world, it's really around manufacturing, around logistics, enabling AI to navigate what we experience in real world. So far, a lot of those AI models has been in the digital world, whereas this is more of a bigger one around the spatial intelligence space. For me, that's exciting because it touches still a lot of GDP of the world around manufacturing. It's not just the knowledge work, Whereas in the UK, we tend to think everything revolves around services and knowledge, whereas a lot of the world is still around manufacturing. And we can see that both, in overall consciousness around the world, figuring out how they want to onshore their supply chain, put aside the political ideology, but I think it's just more of creating more stuff, ability to producing more stuff, having that spatial intelligence, that AI model to help to push any sort of manufacturing is exciting because those are the jobs where you could really utilize AI to I would say augment how a person to do manufacturing. So that's exciting. I guess the other thing that comes to mind when it comes to spatial intelligence is almost like transport. Whereas I remember looking at Tesla's AI previously around the LiDAR sensors, how they picked up everyone around them. So I think that also has implication on how transport will work, which means how infrastructure will work. I can only think from the UK perspective. Obviously, we have a whole host of problems with trains and congestion, yada yada. Having sort of spatial intelligence, I think, will help to transform some of those planning in the future, especially when you have a model where everyone can trust and use at the same time. At least that's my thought. Two things: manufacturing and transport, that come straight to mind.
And you're making a good point on how we're moving from, let's say, abstract, that is language, towards something is so very tangible, which is, for example, manufacturing. And Chris, so you're based in Germany, and of course, Germany was very well very well known for its manufacturing prowess. You're also interacting regularly with startups, primarily, for example, in this industrial space. Are you seeing also similar developments of companies using AI for manufacturing cases?
So I don't think this space in general is new. I mean, I remember even 5, 6 years ago, I would see pitch decks around spatial intelligence and the use cases being once you're inside a building, let's say a shopping mall, it's always hard to navigate the different shops and you don't know which floor exactly you need to go to, go and go to a certain store. I think a similar problem you also have when you think about airports that tend to be very complex. And I think there are technologies and startups developed around virtual reality, augmented reality, and obviously also understanding the space and information via machine learning. So I don't think in general this space is new. And honestly speaking, I've really tried to find some website. I landed on some branding community website. I don't think that that is the startup that Feifei Li actually put together. Maybe they actually are not even online, or we'll see later. But I would be really interested in understanding exactly how this technology works. I could imagine that this is really coming from a more computer visioning angle, where you, for example, a couple of years ago when I worked for this AI startup, it was a computer visioning startup, and it was really about understanding different objects in a picture and being able to modify or to adjust lights for basically photos that you need for the commercial real estate space, where you have different light sources, and therefore you need to like really adjust the lighting and the brightness and the contrast and the colors. So I'd be super interested in understanding what's the kind of technology that's behind it? Where exactly is the AI? What is the main task of it? Also, how can really manufacturing companies or engineering companies really benefit from that? I think another point I wanted to just clarify is that the company is valued at 1 billion and it raised 100 million in this round. I think that's just to clarify that point. This is obviously really an incredible number again, especially when you consider that the company was built within 4 months. Although, there's always an official date, and probably in her research, she's been working on it for a couple of years. But I think this is also the kind of funding you need, given all the costs that you have on the cloud space, the data centers, the GPUs. But yeah, that's sort of my take to this news.
So this can be combined with another topic that until last year was a bit of a buzzword, and Meta poured billions in development, which is the metaverse. So where here also we have like a spatial world, we have here like a 3D environment, and it needs to be navigated. And it has been a bit more quiet than it was in previous years. The potential is can be connected. So very good point on. So they have raised here 100 million, but apparently you cannot even find a website. It's also against, it maybe shows that there is a lot of buzz behind. But nevertheless, so here Feifei Li is really one of the top names in the space in academic research for AI. So I will imagine it's well justified that she's able to raise these sums of money. Another question that so come from that is exactly this topic of researchers that decides to go into a startup environment. And so from what I often see is that there is always a big gap between so what we see in research and so on, like in a more constrained environment, and then deploying this into sort of like really production use cases, more so in the industry where you have maybe more restrictions. So this rollout, this go-to-market for this type of companies that require much more than, let's say, just deploying a website and then having like a sign-up form, and then indeed they need to be installed or be available on a level that is some remote factory somewhere, let's say in this can be somewhere like Indonesia or Vietnam and so on. How do you see that as an investor?
I think has been in development, especially in the enterprise space for some time. What I've seen very successfully is almost always some sort of design partner level, that a startup will have a model that, let's say, it's for manufacturing. Let's, for argument's sake, say that, they're based out in Indonesia. So they'll just work with, a few Indonesian large manufacturer to design as well as possible. I guess this entices both the investor to do both things. One, to adopt the solution. Second, if it works well, almost always some of these larger corporates might also invest in it, simply because the startup is working towards their specification and their problem. What one could potentially run into is around over indexation to one's customers' problems. I think just have to have a little bit of awareness around there. But from a GTA perspective, I think that worked best, especially when you're early stage so far that I've seen. It may not be, I guess, the way to go, but, it's definitely one that, try to take on some sort of design partner, working with, I would say leaders in different industries to help improve the solution, the product, the model, if you will. I think I've seen an AI model that basically just tackle like 3 big industries, and then they just find design partners in each of them and try to just roll it out.
So design partners, so having a strong connection with the industry always helps. And then this takes us to like our second development of the week, which is that one of the better known AI model development companies, together with Anthropic and OpenAI, announced that it raised 500 million at a 5.5 billion valuation. And Cohere, again, another company, so led by a very well-known team of former researchers. Really, the team behind is similar to Fefeling, one of the leading minds in the space, and an impressive team. Nevertheless, still also impressive round. Maybe, Chris, you can put some perspective of why this is so important.
ChatGPT is almost like the general body that can answer questions quite accurately. And then if we have a specific knowledge question, we may go on Perplexity. And the reason is being that these particular chatbots are fed certain data that actually give them a bit more edge over the other bots when it comes to specific tasks and domains. And I think in a way, Cohere tries to do exactly that for enterprises. And taking a look on their website, it seems like they really want to speak the language of business, as they coin it, and really try to help businesses succeed with that. So I don't know. I think one example that they show is, okay, well, you have a certain report on financial data and you want to extract some knowledge out of it. And perhaps, or the way I imagine it is that maybe ChatGPT will just summarize it very high level without any data points. And it really isn't much telling you about the report. And maybe Cohere in this case would even give you some CAGR, so a compounded annual growth rate, which is obviously much more interesting. However, I'm not sure if there are any other interesting use cases that they're coming up with. I think in general, also having had multiple conversations now with enterprises, I think really the crux is not necessarily the model itself, but rather the workflows to implement. And I think this is also something we've touched upon quite often in our show.
So you also have this connection between startups and enterprises, and pretty much something that especially not only among startups across the world, but let's say like in Germany, there is often a very strong focus on B2B enterprise applied technology. Let's say like a company in Germany who is focusing AI for enterprises is now facing competition directly from Cohere, who has raised just now 500 million. So how do you see that in terms of, on one side, the specialization of German, European companies has been historically on catering to business customers. And now more and more we see these giant players coming from overseas who are trying to do very similar things, but with a much larger financial level of resources.
Yeah, definitely. I think putting this into a German context, definitely you'd be competing with the likes of SAP, I would imagine, right? Like large corporates that have quite a bit of trust, maybe even Microsoft, maybe even Google, and it's much more integrated, obviously. And I think there's always this hesitancy, perhaps, to really let smaller companies or startups into the core of a company, which are basically the data pools and lakes that you have in the company. So I do think that Cohere in this case would also have to build a brand, and that takes time to really crack the enterprise and B2B sales nugget. I think also in particular now that we spoke about Aleph Alpha, right? Like there was high hope about the German homegrown AI competitor to ChatGPT. Failing also on the performance side doesn't bode well for obviously some of these other startups that are trying to get into Germany and perhaps Europe, because obviously we talk about compliance issues, we could talk about integration, we talk about very long sales cycles or procurement cycles where it's really about testing the security, the functionality of particular technologies.
Recently, I was looking at the SAP that are also trying to position themselves as AI players. SAP based in Germany. Have you seen anything from them? And do you think that they are active in the space?
To be honest, I haven't really looked. So maybe they have.
As often the case, everyone says that they're doing something, and in the end, we don't really know how much is behind. But another thing I want to discuss about this development is simply the valuation. And Max, so here we're seeing a company that reportedly they have 35 million in revenue, and now they're being valued at a 5.5 billion valuation. So is that lofty? Is it so here a common valuation multiple? How are you seeing this from an investor side?
It really depends on, I guess, the overall demand that you're getting with the company and the amount of capital that's chasing some of these companies. As you probably know, the amount of AI startups out there are quite a lot of different applications, but there are also not that many model as compared to what's out there in application wise. And I guess something that is interesting, so I was just looking through Cohere's data, CB Insights, and just trying to understand who are the funders of CB Insights, who are the funders of OpenAI, who are the funders of Cohere, and also just to add to that was like the SAP investing comes to AI. So just an interesting thing that I picked out from Cohere is that Cohere has quite a lot of corporate investors on their cap table, at least based on CB Insights. The likes of Cisco, Salesforce, Oracle, AMD, Nvidia, Fujitsu, and SAP. And I find that quite interesting. It almost feels like they are trying to go down the design partner route with large corporate, which then has direct implications on the overall valuation. Because if some of these larger corporates, when they invest into something and they decided to use Cohere over, ChatGPT, it will have direct implications on the revenue, then direct implications on the overall valuation. So I guess that's one thing. And then I tried to then look at OpenAI. And OpenAI's investment board, other than Microsoft, the big board, big corporate, most of their investors are really VCs, which is kind of created a new category in a way. So I kind of see that as competition trying to figure out which, I guess, path and route they would take. ChatGPT is trying to appeal to almost everyone, like every single large tech visionary would. Whereas Cohere is really trying to steer away from that and try to be more enterprise focused. They also did Aleph Alpha. They also did Anthropic from an AI side. So it really feels like from a valuation perspective, there will also be some corporate will just spread their bets. Whereas on the other side, there are some corporates will just almost like a little consortia, right, revolve around a model that they're trying to work with instead of being entirely controlled by Microsoft, especially what happened after the CrowdStrike incident. I think to answer your question around valuation, I guess it's really relative. If you ask me if it's lofty, I think the fact that they have quite a few corporates, they're on their cap table, which also signals some sort of demand. When I say demand, it's not just from an investment demand, but more from a sales demand, which has more direct implication for instead of you and I think what this will worth in the future.
I wanted here to comment and ask your take on how much financial engineering do you think is taking place in that? You're mentioning that their cap table consists of NVIDIA, Oracle, and the likes. So I can see that they are providing not necessarily cash resources, saying here's a check of 100 million, 500 million Cs, but all of that is computing credits for their hardware, for the data centers and so on. And then also they have this benefit of pretty much pricing these services in some way, right? So they can say, oh, we'll provide so many hours of compute at this price and so on. You're always looking at pitch decks and cap tables and what type of investment deals. Is this happening and how is this structured?
I'm trying to think of any deals that has been financial engineered previously. I don't think you can play so much on the P&L or the overall balance sheet, but I do think you can struck a more strategic deal, if you will, which is operationally, what kind of pricing can you offer to certain large corporates? So if you think about large corporates, if they were to invest, there are three things that we care about a lot, or should I say three different metrics, right? Number one is just increasing revenue, number two, reducing costs, and number three is just reducing risk. And anything that touches any of that will have some sort of structuring around the deal that incentivizes both parties to do something to increase revenue for a corporate, reduce the cost, or overall just reducing risk. From a financial engineering perspective, I haven't quite seen changing of overall balance sheet on how certain revenue will get recognized, but more of helping to enhance the overall corporate's offering to their core constituency in which they serve. And then if you look at Cisco, Salesforce, Oracle, Nvidia, AMD, Fujitsu, SAP even, they are going down, I guess, serving a lot of the large corporates as well, like your Fortune 100s. These are the people that will sell to the Fortune 100s. If you go to Fortune 100s, if you sit around any sort of board meeting, like right in the middle is a Cisco spider leg. So how much revenue will that increase? For example, if how Cohere can be implemented into NetSuite to help reconcile a lot of all those different payments across the ERP system. So I think those are more interesting from a corporate perspective rather than financial engineering.
This idea that the part of the deal can be also distribution is quite interesting one, and we saw it also with Apple and OpenAI, where the models from OpenAI, ChatGPT, and so on now is being integrated into the Apple hardware. but apparently Apple is not paying, but pretty much is offering, hey, we have this massive user base. We're offering you to pretty much make it available, your technology, to all these users, and will not pay you for it. Actually, this is the privilege that you get, and it should be more a bit the other way around. You should pay us to have this privilege. Potentially, it's also happening here.
I think distribution and referral, definitely something like that will happen. But at the same time, these folks are investors in the startup, right? They will want it to be successful. They need to see revenue come through the door in order to rise valuation. Why did they write that check in the first place? They would just say, we'll distribute for you for free, given that we have so much power, which is what happened with Apple, right? Apple, it's kind of like the window to the consumer world, whereas Microsoft is like the window to the corporate world. So just like ChatGPT going down, both of that, they're like, yeah, just take it, just use it. In the future, there will be things that tide might turn. It's a little bit like how Google will have to pay Apple to be on the iPhone. If that becomes the only search engine, then it's going to be the other way around. But obviously that didn't happen.
And for revenue to take place, then we need most likely irrelevant data. And this brings to our third topic of the day, which is all the way in Japan happening, where there has been, according to Financial Times, that has been reporting that the laxer copyright rules in the country has been drawing AI companies to set base there in order to train their models. We had a discussion with Perplexity that they are running into troubles because they are taking data apparently from different websites where they should not have been taking it. Also, this week was announced that Perplexity is also facing some issues with Condé Nast, this famous publisher. They are receiving cease and desist letters from them, from Forbes and others. But in Japan, meanwhile, they are being welcomed, not only them, but pretty much any company, given the lax rules for copyrights. At the same time, those creators who are based in the country, they're not exactly very excited about it because they fear that this will, of course, threaten their industries. The first thought I had, Chris, was that this is being positioned a little bit as a way for innovation to attract companies to the country, saying, hey, with us, you can develop faster, you can have access to this data, and therefore come to Japan. This is a long-term decision. And so moving to the completely different countries. So if you say, you're, for example, in Germany, and you say, hey, let's now do our company in Tokyo because they have better rules there. And this can happen, this can change relatively easily, I would say. How are companies deciding, for example, the decision of where to base their headquarters, their offices, especially considering this competition is happening in terms of who offers the better terms, who is more lax, who is more restrictive in the development of AI?
If we stay in Asia, that's definitely the case for Singapore. Lots of companies, especially the ones that are more international, would set up their base in Singapore just simply because A, they would have access to the Asian markets, and second, obviously because of tax relief. I think those are two reasons. So tax relief as well as like closer to potential customer. And then the third reason is obviously outsourcing, and those are preferably in countries where you have lower cost bases and labor costs are cheaper than where you are based. And usually, for example, the Philippines is a good example because people speak very good English there, so you can like actually get them to do customer support in Western countries. Now, in this case, I think it's quite interesting to me because essentially what they're advertising with is, hey, you can use our data to train your models. And I think from a Japanese point of view, I do understand the reasoning behind it. And I think we've been speaking quite a bit about the European development on the AI front, definitely a lot about the US efforts on innovation within AI, but we haven't really heard much about Asia, maybe just a bit on China, but what about Southeast Asia and India? And I think Japan being still a very mature country, I have not heard any news, to be honest, of anything that's been developed on the AI front that actually reaches international level of interest. And so I think it is smart to think about, okay, how can we attract talents? How can they actually come in and perhaps even build something more Asian, more Japanese in terms of AI model? I think we've spoken about different language barriers, right? And how good is ChatGPT, for example, in a very local Indian dialect? Probably not so much. So I can imagine that that's sort of like the intention of the Japanese government or whoever actually decided it, Prime Minister, I think, to do that. On the other hand, I am a bit doubtful if this is the right strategy in terms of like the data will be swallowed maybe in 6 months' time, and then probably these AI starter will need more fuel. And then the question is, okay, where else or what else? And I don't know if then being strategically located in Japan is actually a good idea, obviously with high costs and also language barrier and so forth.
When teams come to you and they are considering where to be located, you mentioned for traditionally, so these tax incentives that were offered by multiple countries, especially for example here in Southeast Asia and so on. How do you advise them to think about where to be based, even for example within the same country, right? So you're based in Germany, and of course you have the option to be based, for example, like in Berlin, traditionally very well known for startups, but there are other cities in the country as well, right, where they can be based. Should companies be thinking about where should they set office?
Again, I think we or what you probably refer to as startups, and I think it really depends a little bit on the ecosystem you want to be immersed in. And when I think about ecosystem, really what I think about is the kind of customers you want to serve, the kind of advisors and suppliers you want to be engaging with. Definitely compliance and setting up a company where it is easier is also something to consider for. So I'm really amazed that people are actually setting up startups in Germany because it's so bureaucratic. And I mean, you can fax the tax office in Germany even still if you have a tax machine out at home. So I believe there are better markets or better ecosystems to actually set up a startup. But then also, so for example, if I was just talking to a healthcare team that's looking at setting up a company, and I asked them, well, if you are not bound to Germany, maybe you should consider, I don't know, moving to the US and get yourself into an accelerator there and set up your office in the US, because obviously when it comes to digital health, the leading market is still the US. So any support in terms of funding, in terms of maybe programs are probably best suited to be there rather than in Germany where, I don't know, I suppose things move a bit with a different speed.
And so for established organizations, if they're considering opening an innovation unit, let's say like in Tokyo, an AI team based in Tokyo, will you say this makes sense? Is an incentive large enough to do that? Or you say, hey, in the next election, they will probably abolish this and then it no longer makes sense?
First thing that came to mind about this is basically around how the Middle East is trying to attract all the different crypto companies over. Right. And then they're doing that. They're probably doing a good job because every time you speak to someone that does crypto, they will want to move to that part of the world. So almost like, Japan is trying to pull a page out of their book and try to pull that in Japan. My general sense around attracting startups to the country will have to be somehow aligned to their overall culture as a country, rather than just, do something that probably cause some sort of havoc, which in this case, right, it has, right? You want a lot of creators in that country. There are a lot of artists and musicians, but they also felt that, the lack of protection, which also, may cause them harm overall. And then if you go down that path, you will have bad taste for those startups to even be on the street. The first thing that I can think of that has happened recently, it's around, or should I say, the example that I can think of at the moment is, let's say, in Spain, I think last weekend or the weekend before, they just had a huge protest for tourists, despite tourism being at 14% of the GDP. But at the same time, it's not quite compatible with how people are living there. So you're going to cause, some sort of like havoc. I think all this little underbelly stuff will need to be taken into account. What they're trying to do is trying to push more, I guess, economic policies to try to attract more startups, to try to at least develop some sort of like AI solutions for the country. I think that will eventually come. If I think about how internet came about in Japan, which was, at the moment, I think Yahoo is still really, really big in Japan because SoftBank decided to buy out Yahoo there. I think some of that might actually happen again because SoftBank is invested in quite a lot of all these different AI countries. Whereas, I believe in some sort of state. The reason why I mention this is because there's a state versus market view. So while I believe, some sort of state incentivization could really help to push things up, I also believe that, let the market do its thing while providing more supportive incentives. That's how, at least how I think about it, looking at how internet has come about, at least in Japan, which is, really someone was trying to innovate, building their own thing. And then, the state just incentivized them to do something better, something greater. Yeah, I think one thing that came to mind again was I was reading an article on FT by Muhammad Al Aryan. He's like an economic advisor, obviously previously to the Barack Obama administration, but I think he's now economic advisor to Allianz or something like that. He said something very interesting, which is the US is all about capturing the 80% opportunity, whereas in EU, it's about regulating the 20% of risk. And then I was trying to think, where would that place Asia? Where are they? I think that will help position them as a country to attract talent, because not everybody wants to go to the extreme. There will be people who wants to stay somewhere in between. I think that's just something I'm thinking about. I think the main point I'm trying to make is, I guess let market do their thing, and then there is also an incentivization point that comes in.
And very good point, Chris, that so you advise a company why not go to the US. And this is very interesting in that everyone who has dealt with the IRS knows that also in the US there is a lot of red tape. It's also very complicated very often to do business there, to be taxed there and so on. And nevertheless, because of the market size, the opportunity for investment, it is the place to be very often. And potentially this idea of trying to regulate by being more lax on AI, it might not lead to that many companies taking action, because of course this doesn't change the fact that the market is not Japan very often, but rather, for example, something as the US. And now that Max was mentioning SOHI regulation, we have our next topic of the week, which is the AI Act in the European Union that's coming next month. And it's steering a lot of controversy, discussion, and not necessarily so happy faces, in that it's being derided as not being very precise, being rushed, vague, and stifling to innovation. So here, Chris, as someone in the EU, have you already started hearing from companies, from teams, from organizations about the AI Act that's coming next month? Also because although it's like a massive landmark legislation, I do have the impression that more on the news side has been a bit quiet. There has not been that much discussion around.
I always forget that you guys are not in the EU anymore. Honestly speaking, so maybe not in tune with looking at the latest and greatest compliance policies coming out. However, it's interesting because I think also when I speak to founders in the German market, there are a couple of startups that are actually addressing this, and also I believe, making sure that companies comply to it and they use AI to make sure that they are AI compliant, which I thought was very funny. But obviously, this was just a matter of time, really, to have risen up. And I think in general, it serves a good purpose and a good intent. And I think it's really more the devil is in the detail of how to really, implement it as well as comply to it.
How do you see the potential risk of that companies will be hiring lawyers while everyone is hiring coders just to navigate this legislation?
Oh, 100%, right? 100%. I think this is we used to have, or in recent years, we had to have this data protection ambassador or manager or system administrator. And I'm sure also for this, depending on, I don't know the policy in detail, so I can't say how elaborative it is. Just conceptually, I think it makes a lot of sense to have something in place. Whether or not this is the best way of doing it, I wouldn't be able to tell.
I actually believe it's pretty rushed, and I think I'll probably put the same vein of what I talk about around the Japan topic, which is let the market do its thing, and then regulation comes about. And rushing to regulating, to me, felt like you're going to stifle innovation. It's one way or another. You need to have some ability to wonder in order to innovate. You cannot just, and say that, these are all the straight lines and off you go. This is how you innovate, and this is the box that you can play in. I've come to appreciate a lot more on the ability to wonder, the ability to try out different things in order to get a very different result. And a lot of those regulations are done based on what we understand AI today. I'm not saying it won't change. I'm pretty sure it's an evolving document. But, what is going to happen to AI today versus what's AI going to be in the next, 5-10 years, it's probably going to be super, super different. If you look at internet itself, if we have regulated internet and capped the amount of MBs people can use, And I was like, we're all be dead right now. I cannot be recording this with you simply because there's just not enough bandwidth to do it. Overall sense is it's going to put extra burden on AI companies. And I'm also seeing that, I guess, in the financial services standpoint as well, because regulation also affects directly from financial regulators on banks. And there is just so much red tape around it. It's so hard to come up with anything that you want to try. I guess good thing is startup could do that and then try to sell it back in, but when they come in, they still have to go through the whole regulation stuff. So my general sense is I do feel like it's a bit rushed, especially AI haven't actually take its form yet. It's not like there's a mobile killer app from AI yet. At least that's my view. They could have drafted it and waited for something to come before roll it out.
And to your point on, so if we think about the internet, how it started, and also this idea of it was also like capped with a certain number of megabytes that you could buy as a pack and so on. And of course, internet today looks very different than 10 years from now. Maybe this means that also here regulation is very transitory, right? So that maybe today we have this set of rules, but then along the way, 5 years down the road, this will look very, very different from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I think to your point, right? There's something around rules and there's something around enforcement. So we'll see how much of it is being enforced. If it does enforce, I feel like it's going to put quite a lot of burden, and especially like what you and Chris was talking about, which is hiring extra lawyers, extra coders to slap on extra costs on startup, whereas those money could have gone into development. Don't know if it's a very good use of capital.
On the other side, I have to say, I think it's quite positive that they were so quick to come together as the EU. And guys, remember, there's so many
Sure.
countries with different interests, and that they were able to bring this act out. And I think, again, the intention of this is positive. They want to be safe. They want to, they state that they want to make sure that people don't get exploited, the vulnerabilities, etc. So again, I believe it is in the intent a good one, and that they started to lay the foundation. And yes, I think it will need to evolve with current technologies. And I think also what is a big debate in the EU is obviously how can we stay competitive. So I would trust and hope that the people deciding and being in the decision seats will also take that into consideration.
Yes, and the topic of regulation is happening all across the world. Also, we had this other news coming so from China, so where apparently the AI companies there, locally based, like ByteDance, Alibaba, Tencent, and so on, they need to go through regulatory approval. So just as the internet has some set of restrictions in the country, same thing is happening apparently with the development of AI models. And this made me think so from the perspective of so companies that are operating worldwide, and they need to comply with to local rules and so on. I can imagine that we'll see more occasions around the world that will say, hey, actually, these type of large language models, they are just general question answering machines. So then I want that the answers that they give comply to a specific set of responses that correspond to the way that we see the world. And this might not be necessarily the way that other countries see it. And if we think about enterprises that are rolling out these systems, this means that potentially each location, so across each multinational, will need to have its own set of AI potentially, right? So like let's say like Germany will be like a German model, the French model will be different. So for like the French office and so on. Chris, are you seeing from large organizations this set of thoughts or start to plan around having to really so cluster or segment their AI deployments instead of having like a global deployment, but really try to adjust to these restrictions? For example, EU rules that a US company for their employees in the EU has to apply a certain set of rules versus in the US and so on?
Yeah, definitely. I think that is definitely on people's minds, like in terms of as data storage and where exactly is the company, where's the headquarter, under which jurisdiction do they operate. I think those are very important questions. And this is also for another project that I'm doing right now. We're also looking at B2B, and I think what we hear from interviews from potential customers is that one of the biggest factors that they look at is definitely the location of your particular company, and whether or not this is like in in a country like in a Western country and not like, data centers in China or whatnot. I think this is definitely one point. I think the second one is also how recognized you are, which I found very surprising, especially when we spoke to potential users in the US. It was all about, it's the gold standard of something, or it's very popular, and it really is a proxy for how many people use it. And in the event, or in the case that the company goes rogue or whatever, then more people will actually be able to complain. And I think we just saw it recently with CrowdStrike and the entire aviation landscape and financial landscape being completely put on hold. And I think this just shows like how now I think CrowdStrike needs to like actually go to the US court and really testify what really happened. I think just shows that typically when it comes to companies, the location of jurisdiction, the popularity, or the size of how many customers they serve is really, really important for people to make decisions.
Absolutely, and this point that you're making on data center location and, for example, representation of data. I had just this week a conversation with a company based in Canada, and they were telling me that they are only allowed to work with Canadian vendors. They cannot host their data with US providers, and that was very new to me because I would have said, hey, they're neighbors, they're very similar compared to, for example, the US versus Europe. I would not have realized that this is already an issue of, as a Canadian company, you have to host locally and not necessarily in the US. And just as we've seen with data, likely this will happen so with AI. But at the same time, so it's bringing us to the last news of this week, which is Meta. That already Meta is complaining with the EU about all this regulatory craziness, so to say, where the EU asked that Meta, who are developers of the Llama models, very popular family of LLM open source models, open weight models, the EU requested, please stop training with European data. And Meta is saying, okay, we'll do it. However, this will stifle innovation. And we can see here already this push and pull between companies and regulators, legislations, and so on. Max, how are you seeing this from an investor perspective? So do you think this can affect, for example, portfolio companies, can affect any companies that you're exploring working with, in that on one side they are based in some location, but on the other side they need to comply with these regulations, and these regulations might not be necessarily that friendly towards AI with the data they can use?
Yes, definitely on the data side, where if, let's say, you don't allow them to use data, then the question is why? Why are they there? Any single company will need to use data. I do agree it will directly impact the overall competitiveness of setting up AI company within EU. I guess in a way good for the UK because you just move over, or the US because everyone would just go over to the US. So that's, that we are seeing some startup that start to think about where to move their companies to for both, the reasons around the market size, but also the ease of doing business. And I'm also thinking about, don't use European data. I find that quite hard to enforce. So obviously, if you think about Europe is like the world's library, if you will. A lot of all those traditional stuff, a lot of history are all in Europe. And to train your AI model, you will invariably touch on something that is EU related because that's where humans kind of like develop a lot of the consciousness, etc., on our overall, I would say, development of the world comes from. And how are you going to differentiate what's EU data, what's not EU data? At what point do you start? I feel like it's going to create more problem than the ability to navigate the regulatory landscape. We are seeing startup, if it's harder to do business, they will move. I think that's really the headline, because they are trying to do something hard already. It feels like it's making it a little bit harder. So I guess I'm a little bit libertarian from that view perspective.
That's a very good way to put it. Also, to pretty much to wrap up our show this week. So really, so if there is these restrictions on, maybe so companies will go elsewhere. So it's just as Chris was suggesting, maybe the US because of the market attractiveness, the investors, and so on. So this was what we had for this week, where we discussed on one side these massive rounds happening. We're also talking about all these regulatory happening across the world, in Japan, becoming more lax to attract companies, but also in the EU, in China, adding restrictions that in the end might not be necessarily leading to innovation to companies setting shop in the country. For everyone who has been listening to us, has been fantastic. Remember to like, subscribe, share, give us our comments, provide any feedback. We're here to hear, to listen, to adjust, and looking forward to meet you next week. Thank you for being here, Max, Chris, and I'm very happy that you were here this week. I'm eager to talk to you next week.
Thank you, guys. See ya.